بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين سيدنا محمد عليه أفضل الصلاة وأزكى التسليم. We are starting with special sense, and the first lecture in vision is optics of the eye and its disorders, accommodation and pupillary reflexes. So we are studying in these lectures the optics of the eye and the pupillary light reflex accommodation to near vision reflex. In these lectures we have to know the meaning of refraction and how this occurs in concave and convex lenses, defining the refractive power of the lens, formation of an image by the eye, the mechanism of accommodation, and errors of refraction and some other vision disorders like cataract and corneal opacities, studying the pupillary light reflex, the meaning of critical fusion frequency for rods and cones, discuss visual acuity. So these are the objectives of this lecture. Principles of refraction. The process of refraction is the turning or bending of the light waves when it travels from one medium into another of different optical density. It is the process of turning or bending of the light when it passes from one medium into another of different optical density. This man tries to catch this fish. That is the real position of the fish. Light rays emerging from the body of the fish is refracted when it travels from the water medium into the air medium, and as the man is looking, he is going to detect the location of the fish at this point. Why? Because of the refraction of the light rays coming from the real position of the fish. What is the meaning of refractive index of a transparent substance? The light rays usually travel in air with a speed or velocity of 300,000 km per second. That is the velocity of light in air. And the light can travel in different transparent solids and liquids, but with slower velocity. So the refractive index is considered as the ratio between the velocity of light rays in air to the velocity in the substance or in the medium. For example, if we have a glass, and this glass and the air velocity at this type of glass is about 200,000 km per second. So the refractive index of this glass is 1.5. It is the ratio between the velocity of light in air to the velocity of light in the glass, 1.5. So in this slide we define what's the meaning of refraction and what is the meaning of refractive index and how can we calculate it. Refraction of light rays at an interface between two media with two different refractive indices. Here we have light rays traveling from air to glass, but they are striking the glass interface at a perpendicular manner, so there is no bending or deviation, only the velocity of transmission decrease. But if the light rays are going to strike an angulated surface, and we have here beams or different beams, we have a lower one or the lowest one, and we have the highest one. If we look, the lowest beam is going to hit or strike the glass before the highest one. So what is going? The lowest beam, when it strikes the glass, firstly it will show slow down, while the highest glass is going to continue with high velocity. So it is going to continue with higher velocity than the lowest beam. Again, the highest beam continue with high velocity, while the lowest one will hit the glass and start to show decrease in its velocity. And the difference in velocity between the lowest beam and the highest beam will cause the upper beam to travel ahead of the lower, cause the upper beam to travel ahead of the lower. So the wave front become angulated. The wave front become angulated because the direction of movement or traveling of the light rays is perpendicular to the plane. So in response to hitting of the light rays to an angulated surface, there is something which is called the bending of the light rays. And in this example the light rays are bending down. So that is the response or the change of the light when it hits an angulated surface. Okay, let us go and apply this for lenses. Application of refractive principles to lenses. We have two types of lenses. The first one is the convex lens, second is concave lens. And if we look here to the convex lens, the light rays that are perpendicular to or passing through the center of the lens show no bending, and this usually is the same in convex lens and in concave lens. And if we look here to the light beams that are peripheral or are present in the periphery, they are going to hit the lens, and here the surface of the lens or the interface of the lens is angulated, and with the response of this angulation, what is going, we have bending of the light rays. And if we look to the bending, part of the bending will be done by the anterior surface of the lens, and the second half of bending will be formed by the posterior surface of the lens. So what is going, the light rays are going to see or to show bending toward the central beam. The peripheral beams or the peripheral light rays start to show bending toward the central beam in order to form something which is called a focus, or the focal point are going to be collected or focused in the focal point. That is for the convex lens. If we go and apply this for the concave lens, we have here the angulated interface, and as the peripheral light beams hits the angulated interface, they are going to show what? To show bending, and the bending is coming perpendicular from the surface. And as I mentioned, half of the bending produced by the anterior surface and second half is produced by the posterior surface. So as the light rays is coming perpendicular to the plane, the concave lens produce divergence of the light rays, producing divergence of the light rays that pass through it. Divergence of the light rays that pass through it away from the center. So here the convex lens is known as the convergent lens, produce convergence of the light rays. The concave lens produce divergence of the light rays, or named as divergent lens. Okay, so next we are going to look to how do we mean by the focal length of a lens. What is the meaning of the focal length of the lens? Focal length of the lens. What is the meaning of the focal length of the convex lens? The convex lens is producing convergence of the parallel light rays, and they are focusing this parallel rays into a focal point. So the focal length is the distance behind the lens at which the parallel rays are focused in, and that is the focal point. That is the focal point of the parallel rays coming from a distant source of light. But if we have a near source of light, the light rays emerging from this light or from this near source of light is divergent, as you see, and when they strike the convex lens will produce focusing of this divergent light rays and focusing them into a distant or a much far focal point. So the divergent light rays arising from near object is going to be focused in a distance, or the focal length in this condition is longer than those of the parallel rays. But if we can increase the convexity of the lens, and as we increase the convexity of the lens, increasing its power to produce bending of the light rays, we will bring this focal point to be the same as for the parallel light rays. We will bring the focal point to be the same as for the parallel light rays. So increase convexity of the lens can keep the focal point or the focal length of the near light sources as that for the parallel rays. And this is occurring inside our human eye when we have something which is called accommodation to near vision. The lens of the human eye can increase its convexity, and this will produce focusing of the near sources of light into the retina, the same as for the light or the far objects. So this demonstrates that both parallel rays and divergent rays coming from near objects and the parallel rays coming from far objects can be focused at the same distance beyond the lens, providing the lens changes its convexity, increasing its convexity. What is the meaning of the refractive power of the lens? How can we measure the refractive power of the lens? And what is the meaning of the diopter? If we look here, that is a parallel light rays, and they are focused in a distance of about 1 meter behind the lens. So if we divide 1 meter to the focal length, which is equal to 1 meter, this will produce what? The refractive power of the lens, which is equal to 1 diopter. So the unit of refractive power is known as the diopter, and the refractive power of the lens equal 1 meter distance over the focal length. In this situation, in this condition, we have what? We have the lens and the focal distance is about 10 centimeter, and when we divide the distance, which is 1 meter, over the focal length, we will get the power of this lens is 10 diopter. So the power or the unit of refractive power of the lens is known as the diopter. The more a lens bend light rays, as the lens produce more bending of the light rays, the greater its refractive power. Now we are going to the formation of an image by convex lens. Point sources in front of the lens will be focused behind the lens. That is an object, and the point sources arising from this object are going to hit or strike the surface of a convex lens, and the convex lens will form an image of this object behind it. This is known as the formation of an image of the object by the convex lens. For example, we have here this tree, and this tree as an object is formed of multiple points or multiple lights, and each one or each point has something which is called different brightness, different color. And what is going, if we put a convex lens, and behind this convex lens a white sheet of paper, and put this white sheet of paper at the focal distance or the focal length of this lens, what's going, there is an image formed of the tree behind the lens. So each point source of light on the object comes to a separate point focus on the opposite side of the lens. Each point source of light on the object comes to form or to a separate point focus on the opposite side of the lens in line with the lens center, in line with the lens center. So any object in front of the lens is considered as a group of multiple points of light, and these multiple points of light are different in the brightness and different in colors, and the convex lens will form an inverted image upside down relative to the original object or with respect to the original object. The same, the human eye containing a convex lens, and this convex lens here present in the cornea and present in the cornea and the human lens will form an image of this flower at the focal length of the eye, at the retina. So now we are going to study how our lens system inside our eye form an image of the objects around us. Formation of an image by the eye. The lens system of the eye is composed of 4 refractive interfaces. The first interface is between air and the anterior surface of the cornea. Second, between the posterior surface of the cornea and aqueous humor. Third, between aqueous humor and the anterior surface of the lens. And the last one is between the posterior surface of the lens and the vitreous humor. And the refractive power of the eye is about 59 diopters, and 2/3 are made by the cornea, and the remaining third is produced by the lens. And as we see, the convex lens form an inverted image of the object on a white sheet of paper. Yes, the cornea and the lens can form an inverted image of the object on the retina. So the lens system, which include the cornea and the lens, can produce an image of the object on the retina, and this image is inverted and reversed with respect to the original object, and this image is inverted and reversed with respect to the original object. Going now to study the cornea and lens. Before studying the cornea and its role in the formation of an image on the retina, we have to study the precorneal tear film. What is the meaning of the precorneal tear film? It is a tear film that covers the anterior surface of the cornea, and it is formed of 3 layers. The first layer is the superficial oily layer. Second is the middle tear layer, and thirdly, or the last layer, is the deep mucous layer. Superficial oily layer secreted from a certain gland called meibomian gland, and this oily layer prevents the rapid evaporation of the watery layer or of the tear layer, and also it prevents the overflow of tears across the lid margin. It covers the edges of the lid margin, and this will prevent the overflow of tears across the lid margin. The second layer, which is the watery layer, or it is the tear layer secreted from the lacrimal apparatus, and it has the following functions. Number 1, it is a source of oxygen to the corneal epithelium. Number 2, it fills the spaces between the corneal epithelium and prevent dryness of the corneal epithelium. It prevent the dryness of the corneal epithelium and keep it moist. Also, it lubricates the lid movement to prevent corneal ulceration. It produces lubrication of the lid movement to prevent corneal ulceration, and it has an antibacterial action. The last layer is the deep mucous layer, which contains mucin that is secreted from the goblet cells, and its function is to convert the corneal epithelium from hydrophobic into hydrophilic, allowing the corneal epithelium to be wetted by the tear fluid, easily by the tear fluid. So we have the precorneal tear fluid film, which include the superficial oily layer, the middle watery layer, and the deep mucous layer. Then we are going to study the cornea. Cornea is the transparent anterior part of the outer eyeball. It is the transparent anterior 6 of the outer coat of the eyeball. It is 11 mm in diameter and about 1 mm in thickness. That is the cornea. If we look to the histology of the cornea, cornea is formed of 5 layers. The first layer is the stratified squamous epithelium, and then we have Bowman's membrane, which is a thin elastic membrane. Then we have the corneal stroma, that represent about 90% of the thickness of the cornea and consists of collagenous fibers embedded in a matrix. Then we have another elastic membrane which is called the Descemet membrane, and Descemet membrane is the thin elastic membrane. Then we have the inner endothelium, which is flat endothelial cells, single layer of flat endothelial cells. That is the structure of the cornea. Nutrition and metabolism. Energy production of the cornea is essential for the maintenance of its dehydration and transparency. Normally, the cornea is avascular. No blood vessels are present in the cornea. So, how can the cornea obtain oxygen and glucose? It mainly uptakes oxygen from tears and supplied by glucose from aqueous humor, and the blood capillaries that surround the corneoscleral junction supply both oxygen and glucose. So the tear fluid provide oxygen to the cornea, the aqueous humor located behind supply it with glucose, and the blood capillaries at the corneoscleral junction supply it with oxygen and glucose. The cornea contains ascorbic acid and glutathione that acts as hydrogen acceptors in anaerobic metabolism. So, in order to maintain the cornea as a transparent, the cornea is a transparent structure. This is essential for the passage and refraction of light entering the eye to form a sharp image on the retina. So, we are going to look for the causes of corneal transparency and the factors that maintain this transparency. Now we are going to look for the causes that produce the transparency of the cornea and the causes that maintain this transparency. Starting with the causes of corneal transparency. The causes of corneal transparency include anatomical factors as regular and uniform arrangement of the epithelial cells and lamellae, absence of blood vessels and myelinated nerve fibers. The cornea has no blood vessels, has no myelinated nerve fibers, as well as the regular and uniform arrangement of the epithelial cells and lamellae. If we go to the physical factors, we will start with number A, the refractive index. The refractive index of the layers of the cornea is the same. In spite it is formed of 5 layers, they have already the same refractive index. Number B, relative corneal dehydration. Relative corneal dehydration. Normally, the cornea is kept dehydrated to avoid its cloudiness. No water is accumulated in between the fibers. No water is accumulated in between the layers of the cornea. And this corneal dehydration is produced by 2 mechanisms. The first one is the osmotic bump. What is the meaning of the osmotic bump? The aqueous humor and tears are considered as hypertonic relative to the corneal tissue, so they draw water from the cornea. The aqueous humor and the tears are considered as hypertonic, so they allow or draw water from the cornea. Secondly, the metabolic bump. Metabolic bump. It is an active process using energy, and this energy comes from the corneal metabolism, especially from the last layer of the endothelium, and it pumps water from the cornea to the aqueous humor. So the cornea is considered relatively dehydrated by the osmotic bump and the metabolic bump. No water is allowed to accumulate in between the corneal fibers by the osmotic bump and metabolic bump. After that, we are going to look for the factors that maintain the corneal transparency. Factors maintaining corneal transparency. The factors that maintain the corneal transparency include vitamin A, and it is essential for maintenance of healthy corneal epithelium. Essential for maintenance of the healthy corneal epithelium, and its deficiency can produce keratinization of the cornea. The stratified squamous epithelium will be changed into keratinized stratified squamous epithelium that leads to opacity of the cornea. So, vitamin A is essential for the maintenance of the healthy corneal epithelium. Secondly, we have vitamin B2 or riboflavin. It is important for tissue respiration, especially the avascular structures of the cornea. Its deficiency leads to hypoxia, and this hypoxia is compensated by corneal vascularization, growth of new blood vessels from the corneoscleral junction and their movement to the cornea. This corneal vascularization causes corneal opacity. Moistening of the corneal surface by tears, as dryness of the cornea disturb its transparency. If there is dryness of the cornea, this will produce its or disturb its transparency. Metabolic bump of the endothelial cells, it leads to or maintains the state of dehydration of the cornea, so prevent corneal cloudiness. The bumping of water to the aqueous maintain the corneal transparency and prevent the corneal cloudiness. So we have factors that maintain the cornea transparent, and this includes vitamin A, vitamin B2 to prevent the corneal vascularization, moistening of the cornea by the tears, and the metabolic bump of the endothelial cells to prevent the corneal cloudiness. Functions of the cornea. Cornea has many functions which include the following. Number one, it is a transparent structure allowing the passage of light rays into the eye. It is the window that brings the light rays to inside your eye. Second, it is the most important refractive media of the eye. As we mentioned, it has a powerful convex lens about 39 diopter, and this is considered 2/3 of the dioptric power of the eye, and its refractive index is 1.38. The regular curvature of the corneal surface helps in the formation of a sharp, clear image on the retina. Again, its regular curvature helps in the formation of a sharp, clear image on the retina. It has a protective function. It protects the delicate intraocular structure because it forms with the sclera a fibrous coat that protects the delicate intraocular structures. It is considered with the sclera as the tough fibrous coat that protects the delicate intraocular structure. It also absorbs ultraviolet rays which are dangerous to the retina. The cornea itself is protected through the following mechanism. Number one, the corneal reflex. Touching of the cornea with any object or with a piece of cotton cause reflex spasm of the contraction of the orbicularis oculi muscle. And if we look here, that is the afferent neuron, which is the trigeminal nerve or the ophthalmic division of the trigeminal nerve, and the center is present in the motor nucleus of the facial nerve that supplies the orbicularis oculi muscle. And this corneal reflex is protective against what? Against any object or any foreign body that can or touch the cornea. Secondly, the cornea is protected by the precorneal film of tears, which dilutes and washes irritant substance and also has antibacterial actions. The precorneal fluid tear, which dilutes and washes irritant substance. So that is the functions of the cornea. Transparent, it is a great convex lens. Regular curvatures forms and a clear image of the object on the retina, and it produce protection. It also produce protection to the inner delicate structure of the eye. Also, the cornea itself is protected by the precorneal tear fluid film and the corneal reflex and the corneal reflex. Abnormalities of the cornea. Abnormalities of the cornea include keratoconus or the conical cornea. It is a congenital condition in which there is a conical protrusion of the cornea. The cornea is cone in shape, and this usually is corrected by contact lenses or corneal grafting. Second is corneal opacity, the condition in which part of the cornea becomes non-transparent, and this usually follow corneal ulceration, follow corneal ulcers. And the last abnormality which may occur in the cornea is astigmatism, in which or in this condition the curvature of the cornea are not the same in all directions. The curvature of the cornea is not the same in all directions, and is treated by cylindrical or contact lenses. Now we are going to study the lens, and regarding to the lens, we are going to ask few questions and try to answer it. What is the lens? The lens is a vascular, transparent, biconvex elastic structure that is located between the aqueous room and the vitreous room. Again, it is a vascular, transparent, biconvex and elastic structure, and is located in between the aqueous humor room and the vitreous humor room. That is the first question. Second question, what is the structure of the lens? The lens is enclosed in an elastic capsule, and it is formed of concentric layer of modified fibrous cells, and if we look to the lens, which is held in place by a certain ligament called the circular lens ligament, or it is named as the zonule, which is attached to the ciliary body. So it is held in place by the zonule fibers and which is attached to the ciliary body. If we look to the third question in this slide, which is what are the factors that keep the lens transparent, or why our lens is transparent, we will find the answer is number one, the uniform arrangement of the lens fibers. Secondly, it is a vascular structure, absence of blood vessels. Also, as we see in the cornea, the process of dehydration that prevents the water accumulation in between the fibers and preventing the cloudiness. So we have active process of pumping of water to produce or to maintain the dehydration of the lens. And if we look to the factor number 4, it is the constancy of chemical composition. The fibers are not changed, the protein that is present in the fiber are not changed, or their structure is kept constant. And lastly, the refractive indices of the various structures in the lens are nearly normal. The refractive indices of both the elastic capsule as well as the fibrous cells are the same. So there is no more bending of light rays, or there is no changes in the refraction of the lens. So why the lens is transparent? Uniform arrangement of the fibers, a vascular dehydration maintained by the active pumping of water, constancy of its chemical composition, and the equal refractive index between its structures. That is the lens. Next question is how the lens obtain its energy. How the lens obtain or get its energy. Lens metabolism is important and essential to maintain its transparency. To maintain the lens transparency, the lens should produce energy, and the energy is usually derived from oxygen and glucose from aqueous humor. The lens obtain oxygen and glucose from aqueous humor. Most of the lens metabolism is anaerobically, but at little extent or at some extent some aerobic metabolism can occur, and in this condition the lens needs glutathione and ascorbic acid to act as hydrogen acceptor. It needs glutathione and ascorbic acid to prevent the accumulation of hydrogen ions and oxidative stress. In cases of decrease the concentration of glutathione, as occur with aging or in patient with renal failure, there is increase in the process of oxidation of the protein by the free oxygen radicals, and there is much destruction or damage of the lens proteins that predispose to loss of the corneal transparency or the formation of cataract So lens obtain its oxygen and glucose from the aqueous. Most of the metabolism is anaerobic. Some energy obtained from the aerobic oxidation of glucose. It needs high concentration of glutathione and ascorbic acid to maintain its transparency. Cataract can occur with oxidative stress and oxidation of the protein present in the lens. What is the role of the lens in accommodation to near vision? The role of the lens in near vision or accommodation to near vision is discussed or studied by the accommodation reflex. In response to a blurred image or a blurred near image of the object, if you try to approximate your slide, your book, or the story you are reading to your eyes, what's going? The image of the letters will be like this, blurred, but suddenly or rapidly the image will be clarified like this. What's happened? In response to the blurred image of the object, there is medial convergence of both eyes due to contraction of the medial recti muscles in both eyes. There is pupillary constriction to increase the depth of focus, increase convexity of the lens to increase its dioptric power. So in response to the blurred image of the object, we have medial convergence of both eyes, pupillary constriction in order to increase the depth of focus, and there is an increase in the convexity of the lens by increasing the curvature of the anterior surface of the lens to increase its dioptric power. If we look to the pathway of this accommodation reflex, the stimulus is a blurred image of the object, and the receptors are the photoreceptors of the retina. The afferent pathway from optic nerve to optic chiasm to the optic tract to the lateral geniculate body of the thalamus, and the lateral geniculate body is going to send the impulses to the primary visual area of the cerebral cortex in the occipital lobe, to the primary visual area of the cerebral cortex in the occipital lobe, and the efferent will arise from the occipital cortex to the Edinger-Westphal nucleus of both sides. That include the oculomotor nucleus, from Edinger-Westphal nucleus on both sides to the oculomotor nucleus, and the oculomotor nucleus is going to produce stimulation of the oculomotor nerve and the short ciliary nerves that will produce pupillary constriction and contraction of the ciliary muscle. At the same time, we have stimulation of the eye movement area of the frontal lobe, that's going to produce medial convergence of both eyes. So if we go to the next slide and see in detail the pathway, blurred image of the object stimulate the photoreceptors, optic nerve to the optic chiasm to the optic tract to the lateral geniculate body in the thalamus to the optic radiation going to the primary visual cortex, and the primary visual cortex is going to send impulses to stimulate the Edinger-Westphal nucleus on both sides, and when it stimulates the Dinger-Westphal nucleus on both sides, stimulation of the oculomotor nerve to the short ciliary nerve, this will produce pupillary constriction and increase in the convexity of the lens. At the same time, there will be stimulation of the eye movement area in the frontal cortex, and this will produce what? Will produce medial convergence of both eyes. Mechanism of accommodation. The mechanism of accommodation is dependent on the parasympathetic stimulation to the short ciliary nerve or to the ciliary ganglia and the short ciliary nerve that will produce contraction of the ciliary muscle. With contraction of the ciliary muscle, we have something which is called the relaxation of the suspensory ligament of the lens, and with the elastic property of the lens is going to show increase in convexity, increase in the convexity of the lens. So with the increase in the convexity of the lens, we have increase in the dioptric power of the lens from 20 diopters at rest to about 34 diopters. That is the response to accommodation. That is the response of the accommodation. The dioptric power of the lens increased by about 14 diopters from 20 diopters at rest to 34 diopters. The mechanism is dependent on the contraction of the ciliary muscle that will produce relaxation of the suspensory ligament of the lens. Here we have another question, and this question is what is the difference between the accommodation of the lens in the relaxed state or in far vision and in near vision. So we have something which is called the amplitude or power of accommodation. It is the difference between the power of the lens or the dioptric power of the lens when accommodation is relaxed, or the accommodation for far vision, and its power when it is fully acted or in full action in near vision. So the difference between the dioptric power of the lens in between far vision and near vision is known as the amplitude or power of accommodation. When the accommodation is completely relaxed or completely in action, this is known as the amplitude or power of accommodation. And if we look here to the age in years and the distance of the near point in centimeters and the amplitude of accommodation in diopters, at the age of 10 years, usually the near point that's appearing or the reading or the letters will appear clear is 7 centimeters, and the amplitude of accommodation is about 14 diopters. And with the advance of age, we have decrease in the amplitude or in the power of accommodation. At the age of 30, the near point is 14 centimeters and the amplitude of accommodation is 7 diopters. Until the age of 60, the near point becomes at 1 meter and the amplitude or the range of accommodation or power of accommodation is 1 diopter. And in this condition, we know it as presbyopia. Presbyopia, which is the difficulty of near vision, the difficulty in near vision due to loss of the lens accommodation or decrease elasticity of the lens. Decrease elasticity of the lens. Usually presbyopia appear after the age of 40 due to the sclerosis of the lens or loss of the lens elasticity. The second response that is present in the accommodation to near vision is the process of pupillary constriction. The process of pupillary constriction. And if we would like to have a point about the regulation of the diameter of the pupil, we have to know that the iris is a circular colored diaphragm behind the cornea and anterior to the lens, and it acts like a diaphragm because it has two muscles. The first one is the radial muscles, which is known as the dilator pupillae muscle, supplied by the sympathetic nervous system, and the second one is the circular muscle or the constrictor pupillae muscle that's supplied by the parasympathetic nervous system. So with near vision or with bright light, there is something which is the stimulation of the oculomotor nerve and the stimulation of the short ciliary nerves to produce contraction of the constrictor pupillae muscle in order to produce pupillary constriction. So the control of the size of the pupil is dependent on the smooth muscles located in the iris. The dilator pupillae muscle produce pupillary dilatation in response to dim light. With bright light or extensive light or with near vision or with accommodation to near vision, we have the stimulation of the parasympathetic nervous system and pupillary constriction. Okay, now we are going to study the functions of the iris. As we mentioned, the iris is a pigmented structure located behind the cornea and in front of the lens. The first function is related to the pigments in the iris. It absorbs all the light rays which enter into the eye except those which pass through the pupil. So it absorbs all the light rays entering into the eye except those which pass through the pupil. Number two, it prevents light from falling on the peripheral part of the lens and allowing the light rays to pass only through the central part of the lens. When we have pupillary constriction and minimizing the amount of light entering the eye, you are going to allow the light rays to fall or hit the central part of the lens and preventing them from hitting the peripheral part of the lens. And this is very important to prevent the spherical and chromatic abrasion. To prevent spherical and chromatic abrasion. What is the meaning of spherical abrasion, or what is the significance of pupillary constriction in preventing of spherical abrasion? As I mentioned, the pupillary constriction minimizes the amount of light entering the eye, allowing the light to strike or to hit the central part of the lens. But if we go and produce pupillary dilatation and more light enter through the pupil and hits or strikes the peripheral part of the lens. The peripheral part of the lens has greater curvature, and so they are going to produce focusing of the light rays, at where at different points we will find there is something which is called multiple focal points, and these focal points is usually nearer to the lens than those coming from the central part of the lens. The light rays coming from the central part of the lens is usually focused at this point, while if we look to the peripheral rays, they are going to be focused in points nearer to the lens. And when this occurs, there is multiple focus present inside the eye, and this will result in a blurred image. So the pupillary constriction prevents the spherical abrasion, allowing the light to strike the central part of the lens, and this will prevent the presence of multiple focus of lights inside the eye and prevent the blurring of image. This will prevent the blurring of image. Chromatic abrasion. The second thing the pupillary constriction is going to prevent, the chromatic abrasion. What is the meaning of chromatic abrasion? It is a failure of the lens to focus all the colors at the same point. Failure of the lens to focus all the colors at the same point. And in cases of pupillary dilatation and the light or the white light is striking or hitting the peripheral part of the lens, the peripheral part of the lens acts as what? Acts as a prism. And the prism is producing analysis of the white light into multiple colors. So this usually results in a blurred image. And this blurred images is usually surrounded by halos. This is prevented by the pupillary constriction. The third function of the pupil, it regulates the amount of light which enter into the eye by regulating the size of the pupil. And number 4, the pupillary constriction increase the depth of focus. What is the meaning of the increasing of the depth of focus? This means that the distance of the object can be changed, but the image is still focused on the retina without the change in accommodation. So the pupillary constriction serves by keeping or increasing the depth of focus, keeping the image of the object fixed on the retina while its distance can be changed, and this can occur without the change in accommodation. That is known the role of the pupillary constriction in increasing the depth of focus. The object is changed in distance and its image is kept focused on the retina by just the change in the size of the pupil without need to change the accommodation, without change in accommodation. Now we are going to study the mechanism of pupillary constriction or the pupillary light reflex. Application of light to the eye will produce pupillary constriction in the illuminated eye or in the examined eye and in the opposite eye. This is the direct pupillary light reflex, and on the opposite side, if we separate between the visual field of both eyes, is known as the consensual light reflex. So application of light to one eye will produce bilateral pupillary constriction. In the examined eye is known as direct pupillary light reflex. On the other side, it is known as the consensual light reflex. And if we look to the pathway, the stimulus is the light stimulating the photoreceptors, and the photoreceptors is going to send impulses through the optic nerve, and the optic nerve will send the impulses to the optic chiasm, to the optic tract. Then the fibers are going to the pretectal nucleus, So from the optic nerve to the optic chiasm and to the optic tract, and before reaching to the lateral geniculate body, some of the fibers will pass to the pretectal nucleus, and from the pretectal nucleus in the midbrain we have fibers that's going to terminate or synapse with the Edinger-Westphal nucleus on both sides, on both sides. Stimulation of the Edinger-Westphal nucleus will stimulate the efferent, which is the oculomotor nerve, synapsing in the ciliary ganglia on both sides to the short ciliary nerves that will produce pupillary constriction. So that is the pathway of the pupillary light reflex. Exposure of one eye to light will produce pupillary constriction on both sides, In the examined eye, it is the direct reflex. On the opposite eye or in the non-examined eye, it's called the consensual pupillary light reflex. Conditions that cause constriction of the pupil: we have miosis with pupillary light reflex, accommodation to near vision, during sleep where the parasympathetic predominates, during the third stage of anesthesia, Horner syndrome due to interruption of the sympathetic supply to head and neck, and drugs like the parasympathomimetics and morphine poisoning. While the causes of mydriasis include sudden withdrawal of light from both eyes, injury or cutting of the parasympathetic supply or the oculomotor nerve to the eye, emotional state due to adrenaline secretion. In the first and second stage of anesthesia due to emotional stress, and also during the fourth stage of anesthesia due to inhibition of the oculomotor nucleus, and this condition is known as a premortal condition. Drugs like the sympathomimetics and parasympatholytics and with distant vision. These conditions are associated with mydriasis. Argyll Robertson pupil is a condition seen in neurocephalus and syringopulpia, or extension of the lesion of syringomyelia to the brainstem. We have failure of the pupil to respond to light with good response to accommodation to near vision. The other condition is reverse argyle Robertson pupil, in which the opposite is occurring. There is failure of pupillary constriction during accommodation with pupillary constriction in response to light, and the condition is usually lesion in the occipitotectal tract. Lesion in the occipitotectal tract. So, with argyle Robertson pupil, there is pupillary constriction with accommodation to near vision, and no response with the pupillary light reflex. In the reverse argyle Robertson pupil, there is constriction with light and no constriction with accommodation to near vision. We have another lesion which is called AIDS pupil, and the pupil is dilated and there is a sluggish pupillary constriction to light. There is sluggish constriction of the pupil in response to light, and this is usually seen in some cases of diabetic neuropathy. In some cases of diabetes, they have this condition, which is a sluggish response of the pupil in response to light or in the presence of light, and usually the lesion is change in the ciliary ganglia. Errors of refraction. The first error is presbyopia, caused by sclerosis of the lens that produce focusing of the light rays behind the retina, and the correction usually occur with convex lenses, and the cause is sclerosis of the lens or loss of elasticity that will lead to decrease in the amplitude or in the range of accommodation. The other errors of refraction include hyperopia and myopia. In hyperopia, there is something similar to presbyopia, with inability of the subject to see near objects clearly because they are focused usually behind the retina, and we correct it with convex lens to bring the image of the near object on the retina. While in myopia, the problem is appearing with far objects which are usually focused in front of the retina and corrected with concave lenses that will bring the image clearly on the retina, So in hyperopia, corrected with convex lens, and in myopia, corrected with concave lenses. Astigmatism. Another error of refraction in which there is either abnormality or change in the curvature of the cornea, or to a less extent the curvature of the lens. The curvature of the cornea or the lens are not the same in all planes, and the light rays that fall on the cornea or focused by the cornea or the lens will have two focuses, one by the whole cornea and another one by the abnormal plane, so that the rays fall on the eye are not focused in one focus on the retina, but some rays in one plane are focused on the retina while those in other plane do not. So we will have multiple focuses inside the retina. Or on the retina. This causes blurring of vision, and usually the condition is corrected with cylindrical lenses. The cylindrical lens change of the lens protein produce a disease which is called cataract, which usually appear with old age or may appear earlier in diabetics. And in cataract, there is a cloudy or opaque area or areas in the lens. In the early stage of cataract formation, the protein in some of the lens fibers become denaturated. Later, the same proteins coagulate to form opaque areas in place of normal transparent protein fibers. They are going to coagulate, and this will create opacity of the lens. When cataract has obscured light transmission so greatly that it seriously impair vision, and the condition can be corrected by surgical removal of the lens. When this is done, the eye loses a large portion of its refractive power, which must be replaced by a powerful convex lens in front of the eye, or can be implanted by an artificial plastic lens which is put in the same place or the place of the removed lens. Visual acuity, the ability of the subject to detect the details of the objects. The human eye can distinguish between two bright points. The human eye can distinguish between two bright points separated by 1 millimeter, and this usually occurs when they are focused on the retina, and the distance between them on the retina is about 2 micrometer. So from a distance of 10 meters you can distinguish two objects or two bright lights separated by 1 millimeter. So this means that a person with a normal visual acuity looking at two bright pinpoints, and this from a distance of about 10 meters, he can distinguish it between the two spots when they are about 1.5 to 2 millimeters apart. That is the visual acuity. Visual acuity means the ability of the subject to detect the details or the fine details of the objects, and usually examined by different ways like Snellen's chart, and the ability of the eye to discriminate 2 points from 10 meters if the distance between them is 1 millimeter is 1 millimeter, and this usually occur due to focusing of 2 points or the presence of 2 points about 2 micrometer on the retina. 2 micrometer on the retina. Lastly, we have the critical fusion frequency. The flicker fusion threshold or flicker fusion rate is a concept in the psychophysics of vision. It is defined as the frequency at which an intermittent light stimulus appears to be completely steady to the average human observers. The interrupted or intermittent light stimulus will appear as a continuous stimulus, and the time resolving ability of the eye is determined by measuring the critical fusion frequency. It is the rate at which the stimulus can be presented and still be perceived as a separate stimuli. Stimuli presented at higher rate than the critical fusion frequency are perceived as continuous stimuli, like in motion pictures and movies. Because the frames are presented at a rate above the critical fusion frequency, you are going to perceive this separate stimuli as a continuous stimulus, The human eye and the brain can distinguish between 10 to 12 images per second. If we increase the velocity of displaying of these images or frames up to 18 and 26, you are going to perceive this, or your brain is going to perceive it as a continuous movie.